Welcome to the latest edition of Broadcasting Today, where we'll be talking to Neil Wallis, former deputy editor of the Sun newspaper and the News of the World and managing editor at News International, and Barbara Serra, Europe correspondent for the Al Jazeera channel, all part of our mission here at Middlesex University, London, to teach students how to think, but also how to do. Welcome to the latest edition of Broadcasting Today. I'm joined today by Neil Wallis, former executive editor, managing editor of News of the World, and Barbara Serra, who's Al Jazeera's Europe correspondent. Welcome to you both. Let me start off with the simple things first. Neil, where did you get into journalism and why?
Oh, blimey, that's a one I have to dust off the memory glands for. I actually, funnily enough, the truth is, as a child I was very ill and I was trapped in bed. And the only thing I had to read was we used to have in our council estate, the council house newspaper then was the Daily Express, right? That came through the door. It was given to me on my sick bed. Everybody else had to go out to work. And I used to read the Daily Express, the broadsheet Daily Express. And I was transported by the bylines. And I actually remember reading these astonishing stories because in those days, foreign correspondents went everywhere, and I'd read about China, read about the invasion of Tibet by the Chinese. I remember reading about Bikini Atoll. And I remember reading all of these things and thinking, one day I'm going to do that.
And so when you decided to do that, you went the traditional route.
I went the traditional route. I actually, my first job was on the Skegness Standard, circulation 6,000. I ended up on the News of the World, circulation 4 million. So it was a bit of a journey on its way. And then I went to a little local weekly newspaper outside Sheffield, did things that were called indentures, which were basically a training contract. And then I moved on to the Leicester Mercury, the Northern Echo in Durham, a fine city in the northeast. Then the Manchester Evening News, and then international newspapers.
There's a lot of criticism now, isn't there, of youngsters wanting to go into journalism, that they don't get this apprenticeship, elongated apprenticeship, where they get to smell and taste what it's really like to report on people's lives. Because in the end, if you're on the Worksop Guardian and you get it wrong, you get it in the ear hole within 24 hours.
Two stories about that. One story, 2 points really. One, it's a serious loss to democracy about the fact that as a 19-year-old boy, I learned my trade in the local council chamber, in the local magistrates court, in the local coroner's court, all those basic things, and they had a reporter in the room who reported on everything from the pig market sales to the local council decisions. That has pretty much gone now, which is a damaging to democracy. In terms of getting things wrong, one of the jobs as a cub reporter was to go to local funerals, and you'd stand outside and take everybody's name of the mourners, right? And I got a name wrong. And this lady was distraught that her name wrong. She turned up at the office. She demanded to see the editor. There was a staff of 5. The editor then called me down for this lady to confront me and to tear me off a strip and to make me apologise. You never forget that.
And presumably that's a good way of always reminding yourself that facts are king.
Get it right.
Of course, Barbara.
Very basic.
Very basic indeed. Barbara, for you, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but you are a different generation and didn't follow the same trajectory in, did you?
No, I didn't. I'll tell you what, though, I did a few years in radio, which was very helpful, because I would say within broadcasting, radio is the one that's most similar to print in the sense that it's you on your own, so without a cameraman or a producer, which in itself, I think, does a lot, because you get used to, I don't know, you need to be a bit brave sometimes, and when you're on your own, it teaches you that. So I did radio. And then I went to TV a few years later, and I have to say, I mean, I still know, I would say most of the people in most newsrooms I've worked in have never had an exclusive in TV. I know that it's awful to admit, and we do have people that do, sniff out the stories. I mean, you did a lot of that. You do a lot of that at BBC London, so you always have one or two. But I think most people that work in broadcasting don't have the contacts, which it takes a lifetime to build, and don't have that instinct. Now, we have other strengths. I mean, I present for Al Jazeera and I present live news, and I would argue, my partner is a print journalist, so we have this discussion a lot. A lot of print journalists would be terrified doing that. It has different challenges, but I totally agree with you when you say that something has been lost. So we end up cannibalizing the newspapers. At every morning meeting, where do we get our stories? We get them from the newspapers, and that's not always a good thing.
However, can I just say, I've sat on the receiving end of these sorts of interviews, and if you're in the middle of a difficult subject, that can be immensely uncomfortable. These guys have 2, 3, 4 minutes to get straight down my throat, and that's happened a few times, I can tell you, when they want to know. And when it's live on TV, there's very little wriggle room. If someone's boring into you, I've been on the receiving end of Jeremy Paxman. That was unpleasant. And that is a different kind of skill. It's a different sort of journalism, I think, because I can talk to somebody and walk away with the idea, the concept, the quotes, and I've talked to them for an hour. You guys talk to me you can talk to me for an hour. You're still going to have 90 seconds, 3 minutes that you can put into your documentary. And that's a real tough thing. I wouldn't want to do that.
We have some skills. I'm just saying that perhaps, finding exclusives.
One of them is that thing about exclusives, actually. Newspapers, particularly national newspapers, are obsessed by exclusive. Television, not nearly so much. A TV exclusive is very often the sort of thing you do, Kurt, which is about, almost documentary style rather than what I would call news.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But one of the things that both of you have been involved in over your careers is searching for alternative narratives. You partly because accident of history and the fact that you've come from so many different parts of the world. You speak half a dozen languages. You schooled in one part of Europe.
Well, it's very London. That's what London's all about. So just for curiosity's sake, I was born in Italy, raised in Denmark, went to an international school, which is why I sound slightly transatlantic, and then came here in 1993 for uni, and then decided I wanted to be a journalist and did the course at City University, and then it was the BBC and Sky. But I think, you always have to, journalism, it's great where you would want to be, and then you have to look around and say, okay, first of all, what are my strengths? Because it's incredibly competitive. If you're not playing to your strengths, just forget it. You're never going to have any kind of career. And secondly, what are the opportunities? What is it right now? I remember when I was still at the BBC, there were so many journalists that were just absolutely refusing to do any of their own filming, any of their own camera work. I mean, I would never, to any budding journalist now, you have to know how to film, you have to know how to edit. And really, you have to know how to write, because you have to write blogs, which then are really the only things that stay on Google forever. So I think it's looking around.
Out of the box as well. Neil, you ended up on News of the World, and for all the things people say about the News of the World, it often tries to find alternative narratives away from what the broadsheets are doing. Some people criticise the News of the World for that, but actually it had a wide circulation because...
Yeah. The truth of the matter is that, you don't sell 4 million papers every Sunday for no reason, and you don't do it simply. Lots of people have tried to do the tabloid story, if you like, and the news agents are littered with them afterwards. They sold simply nothing like. And the trick with the News of the World, just like the Sun as well, because I was deputy editor of the Sun, when I was at the People, I was the editor of the People, doing the same thing there. You mix, if you like, the showbiz with hard-hitting stuff to make that mix that makes it compelling. And the more you can do that mix, I remember some of the greatest stuff that I've ever done, been proud of, is stuff that has then gone on to set all those agendas that you're talking about. Footage. I remember us getting footage of soldiers in Iraq beating senseless young boys they'd caught in a riot, and another squaddy who was on a high point had filmed it while they were doing it. I remember the ricochets of that. I remember us getting footage of initiation ceremonies involving Royal Marines that we ran that were simply brutal. And there's lots of versions of that, that tabloids can do and do. But I think that one of the issues that affects journalism now is because of the cost dynamic is changing so much, is so many people of the experience and getting on into years, is some of that experience is getting lost. Interestingly, however, I do think one of the things that's immensely helped journalism is the internet, in the sense that if you do a programme, you do a story for London Tonight or whoever it is, you actually now brilliantly have to write a piece to go with it that is actually appearing, if you like, in a version of print that's the internet. And I think that's really transforming television news.
And it's incredibly liberating for journalists that are restricted to a minute 30 of script to actually be able to put all that kind of detail that just doesn't fit in a TV story.
Of course, the thing that it also makes you think about is accountability. And trust is right at the heart of what we do. I mean, at the News of the World, it was a constant, wasn't it, that issue of trust.
Well, we're feeling, we're feeling the after effects of this now, aren't we, frankly? There has been a breakdown of trust between print media and the general public. Newspaper sales, print sales as a whole, have crashed. I don't actually think that's just about trust. I think there's an element of trust in that, but it's to do with what you can get on the web. The truth is, Mail Online is the most successful media operation, if you like, in the world in many ways, because of what it puts on there, and so people don't need to actually buy something in print because the tabloid is online. But trust, in the sense of what happened with the hacking saga, was immensely damaging, I think. And what it did was, and you see this in many scandals actually, whenever we've all reported on scandals, and what you see is there is a moment that it's a tipping point where a situation stops being interesting and becomes critical. One thing can happen and suddenly click. And the truth of the matter is, on the hacking saga, the Guardian had been banging on about it for 2 years. The BBC had been banging on it a bit. Neither of them had really got any traction. And then the Millie Dowler story broke, and the suggestion that a tabloid had actually erased her voicemails. Interestingly, all the research shows that it was that, not the listening to it, but the idea of they'd actually been so cold-blooded and so ruthless that it actually erased voicemails was so disgusting that it tipped the whole thing. The game changed, boom. The News of the World itself was dead within a month. This was the biggest selling newspaper in the Western world. Hundreds of people out of job. The fact that the story turned out to be untrue was by the by, but what it did was, that tipping point meant that people took notice of this whole phone hacking thing. And then, as you guys obviously know, that changed the whole ballgame. The Prime Minister, Cameron Panic, brought in this incredibly wide-ranging inquiry by Lord Justice Leveson, infinitely more widespread and with greater powers than any inquiry into the Iraq War. And the contrast, actually, if you look at the rights and powers of the inquiry into Leveson and to the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, with the 45 minutes deadline of WMD, for instance, that report still hasn't been published. When was the Iraq War? 10 years ago? Longer? And it's been blocked and blocked and blocked by politicians and by civil servants because they don't want it out. But what happened was Millie Dowler erasing voicemails, tipping point. Every prejudice you'd ever had in your mind, every sort of story you'd ever heard about the tabloid press, every concept you had was all instantly true. Every story you'd ever heard was...
You got the knock on the door, of course.
Yeah.
And
I don't actually remember this, but at 5:52 on the 14th of July 2011, I was asleep in bed. There was a knock on the door. This was a few days. It was less than a week after the Millie Dowler story. And to be honest, I was expecting it because the police had to do something. The police were so embarrassed by this that so my wife went down and opened the door while I rang my solicitor because you sense the runes, you sense the weather in these things. And 6 burly policemen came into our house, arrested me, searched the house. My wife's standing around in a dressing gown. My son's in bed. They allowed me to get dressed. And then they took me off and put me in a police cell for a couple of hours. Left me there to stew and then kept me there the day, and they questioned me a bit. And then it was 20 months before they finally accepted, and they said no further action was going to be taken.
Was there any relationship between that lady who came to you when you got her name wrong all those years ago when you were a young rookie journalist and that knock on the door?
It certainly felt like it. No, I mean, it was very scary. It had enormous impact on my life, as you can imagine. But, having said that, I understood and shared the disgust over Millie Dowler. I really did. Like the general public, though, I couldn't get too excited about all the celebrities who were allegedly being hacked. Because, when you've been the editor of a national tabloid, when you've been the deputy editor of a national tabloid, when you've done every executive job on a national tabloid, let me tell you, celebrities have beaten, smashed, crawled over broken glass to my door to plead to be in my newspaper. So I know what they're willing to do. And so, but the ordinary people, I think, is unconscionable.
Coming to you, Barbara, on trust, because of course Al Jazeera, one of the reasons it gained traction, particularly here, was because that ebbing away of trust of the network offerings here, ITN, BBC.
I think, I wouldn't say it's a lack of trust, and I have to say, as someone that follows a lot of news sort of outlets in the UK, across Europe, in the States, obviously some of the Arab channels, I have to say that I think British journalism, both print and broadcast, is possibly the best in the world, which isn't to say that there aren't flaws here or people that get it right, but by and large, and whenever I hear people complain about the BBC, and I know that technically you're the competition, so I'm not going to sing your praises too loudly, but yes, they've made mistakes, a lot of networks do, but in all, I think it's possibly one of the best broadcasters in the world. So I think with Al Jazeera, it was more a case that we had to build the trust in the West. So maybe some people gave us a chance when, for whatever reason, they were disenchanted with the offerings in the UK. But I think what we had to do, and it was a real challenge. I remember I joined at the start in 2007, 2006, so 7 years ago. It was very difficult, and people just wouldn't speak to you. If you went around and tried to vox pop people, there was a lot of people that would turn around and say, I don't speak to Al Jazeera, because they thought, we all know what they thought we were. And the only way that we managed to win trust was just by putting out good programming day after day. And then we started winning awards. We won the RTS News Channel of the Year a few years ago, beating the BBC and Sky News. And, that's very difficult because they're great outfits. The Peabody in the States, it's still a bit of a challenge, but we've been nominated for Emmys. We now have a channel in the States. So building trust is really hard, and it takes decades.
But isn't it, Neil, but isn't it the case that Al Jazeera is reaching an audience that has felt poorly served because other networks have been unwilling to look at alternative
I think
narratives.
I think it's different. So first of all, Al Jazeera is an international channel. So arguably, I think in the UK, viewers here are the best served possibly in the world, especially when it comes to foreign news, which is what, well, you know, everything's foreign depending where you are. But, you know, it's what Al Jazeera focuses on, international news. I think in lots of other parts of the world, it filled the gap because our main competitors were CNN International, BBC World, who still remained, even though they were international, quite Anglo-Saxon. And, you know, as someone who is Western but not Anglo-Saxon, I noticed that different. And so I think Al Jazeera is a truly international channel. And if you ever go to our newsroom in Doha, it's like a sort of newsroom meets the United Nations General Assembly, because there's everything there. And so everything is represented. And I think that, you know, that's our unique selling point. That's where we'll win. But also it's the good journalism, you know, you can't hide.
You know, I think Al Jazeera now, like Sky News now, is proof of the single greatest concept in media of any sort. Content is king. Content is always king. So how did Sky News, which was appalling when it began, how did it get to be a colossus that is as big, you know, stands alongside, shall we say, the BBC and ITV? How did that happen? It's because the quality of what they did, they unremittingly put in quality, they unremittingly were straight, and they unremittingly chased the stories and put it on the screen in a way that people trusted. And that's where Al Jazeera had a pretty ropey start, frankly. But what it did was then it realised the only way it could do what it wanted to do was to do exactly what Sky did, which was to say, okay, you know, there's always difficulties in life, but basically we're going to tell the story in the same way as our rivals do, like the BBC, like ITN, like NBC, like CBC, like Sky. And so I think you end up with a situation, accordingly, the RTS. And that happens because of that basic truth. Content is always king.
I also think there's an element, because you mentioned before the strength of the news of the world was putting hard news and then lighter news, and of course we see, you know, the Mail online, which is what we call the sidebar of shame, all the sort of celebrity stuff, and then the serious news. But I think what Al Jazeera doesn't do, which Sky does, and a lot of the American networks do, is that we don't mix light entertainment with hard news. We stick with hard news. And I think because we've also realized who our audience is. And I think if you're going to watch Al Jazeera, you're interested in, you know, quote unquote, hard news, international news. Yes, we have, you know, the human impact of all those stories that we cover. It's not only meetings, but I think that is the main difference as well. And I think now people have realized that that's what Al Jazeera is all about. And that's why,
but
you know,
only
they're
got
finding
to that
us.
point by content, knowing what you were doing
absolutely.
and being trusted to tell the story, not from a particular Arab factional point of view.
Well, when Al Jazeera English launched, it was always that. I think the Arabic channel is different because the audience is different. But if you think about it, Al Jazeera English, you know, if you're in the Arab world, you're going to watch Al Jazeera Arabic because you speak Arabic. So Al Jazeera English is for everyone else. And, you know, it is completely impartial. And if you look at the kind of, you know, David Frost, until he died, God bless him, you know, was with Al Jazeera, Raghi Omar, you know, and a lot of very trusted people, because they knew that there was just no point. No one would watch you.
But a big
and then
part
you lose
of
your
the Al
USP.
Jazeera start point was the way they handled Al-Qaeda, wasn't it? Was the way they handled the missives that were coming out of Afghanistan, of Pakistan, from bin Laden and those people, and the way they did it and presented it without comment pretty much, and said, this is what he's saying now. People then started treating it in an entirely different way, in my view.
It was an access issue, wasn't it? It was they were getting
But
access.
they also didn't spin it.
Yeah.
If you remember, they actually presented it in a very, this is what he says now.
Well, this is the Arabic channel at the time, because it's before the English channel's time. And, you know, tapes would come in and there would be an editorial meeting and they would look, you know, at the whole tape, however long it was. They didn't air everything, not by a mile, but when they saw that there was something newsworthy, they'd air it. And I have to say, people never watched those videos on Al Jazeera Arabic. They watched it on ITN or Sky or the Beeb, where they would say the video released or, you know, through Al Jazeera. So that's kind of how the name got known around the world.
Let me ask you about another which comes out of hacking, actually, and that's the question of professionalism amongst our peers in the business. Do you think that hacking has undermined that reputation for professionalism?
I think there's two things come into that. A, the answer to that is plainly yes. Because if you are perceived to be shysters, then you're not going to be seen to be professional. I think there's an interesting issue going on at the moment with journalism training. I think it's a really big issue, and there's two aspects to it, really. One is that I think young journalists get good technical training now. Law, so on and so forth. I mean, I did it to some extent, but not exactly in a university type setting. However, the danger of the journalism university degree type training is if you like, the Columbia School of Journalism think. Columbia School of Journalism in America is the pinnacle of the supreme 10 commandments of journalism. It's dull. It is desperately, appallingly dull. Nobody reads it. It's just appalling. So if an event is not big, your teeth are going to fall out before you get to the end of a story. However, the danger is of that starting to happen here. And with respect, part of the issue is you look at so many university courses that are actually led by BBC grandees now. I was thinking of Cardiff is like that. The City is like that to some extent, although it has a wider basis. Kent has that. So many courses are, if you're a big honcho, you've been up there at Assistant Deputy General's brother at the BBC, you just walk over.
Essentially what you're saying is you don't have to be a professional like a lawyer to be a journalist, but you do have to have the right technical skills. Do you agree with that, Barbara?
Can I just say, well, I mean, I did the City course, so I did a degree that was completely unhelpful for about 10 years. I did international relations at the LSE. Nothing. It was a good degree, but it didn't exactly get me a job. It helps me now. And then for 2 years, was it 2 years, maybe even 3, I tried desperately to get into any, and believe you me, I wasn't being a diva, any regional newsroom, radio, anything, even some, and it was just impossible to get in. And then I applied to City, got the City course. I was in a job, so even in the Easter holiday, I started at CNN, and by then I was in employment, then I moved to the BBC. So I agree with you. The other thing to say about those courses is that they're quite expensive. And so already you're kind of selecting, okay, you can work, but I think now some of them are about $7,000 a year. I mean, they're very expensive. And so already you're kind of making it selective in that way. But I have to say, and I remember this was 10 years ago, it was just impossible to get any kind of job experience because there's just such a big field of competition.
Unlike Neil, when Neil started, and of course, because he was
maybe that was
learning
outside
on the
of
job,
London as well. I mean, maybe
you had the requisite skills. I mean, I want to finish up our conversation before I ask people if they've got some questions. What do you think that means for the future of journalism? Because ultimately, it's within our gift, isn't it, to shape the future of journalism?
Yes, I think that journalism is enormously benefited by characters. We've known some great characters in journalism, and they infuse journalism. Alan Rusbridger isn't my favourite person, but his character is written through The Guardian. Paul Dacre's character is written through the Daily Mail. And, you need big characters and people need to be characters. I guess what worries me is people, and I don't think this happens very often anymore, can do what I did. To actually come through, it used to be called sitting at Nellie's elbow. I used to sit next to an old sub-editor, and she'd be on a typewriter, I'm afraid. None of you will know what that is. And the idea you'd sit there and look at what she was doing and learn to a certain extent like that. I don't even think that really exists anymore, and I think that's sad.
Yeah, It exists a little bit, but for 5 minutes. So we'll get, I mean, usually what happens, you'll get a trainee from one of the courses, and then they come out with you because, of course, they're completely useless, course or no course. When they walk into a newsroom, they can't do anything. But then I think there's a sort of 6-month window, isn't there? And by then they have to make themselves useful. I guess maybe, you have to invest in people in TV. If you make someone a reporter, you have to give them a cameraman, you have to give them a producer, everything. It goes back to the exclusive as well. You can't just have one guy in a corner, doing his own thing, because in TV it's all teamwork. So, yeah, I don't think, what is it, Nelly's elbow? Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think that
But
is
you know what, though? What will always come out, though, is talent. Talent always comes out. There's a girl on Sky at the moment who came straight out of university. She was a News of the World trainee, Sophie. But she's one of the political team
Sophie
now.
Ridge.
Yeah, Sophie
Yes,
Ridge.
yes.
And she was you just knew this girl was talent. She always wanted to do politics, so we gave her to politics. And I remember her coming to party conferences. We go to party conferences, and these are great events. When you're a big national newspaper, cabinet ministers line up to have dinner with you and so on and so forth. And that's a great thing. You sit down there next to the Home Secretary or something. Sophie never did that. Sophie was always off by herself hunting stories.
Well, they are looking for a new political editor, aren't they, Sky?
Sophie should be in there.
Let's have some questions from the floor.
The phone hacking scandal with the News of the World or whatever. And the first question is, do you reckon that the reporters involved in that scandal were treated appropriately in lieu of the impending court case against two of their lead reporters? And secondly,
I don't know what you mean by appropriately.
I mean, do you think, would you send them to prison, or what would you do if, do you think the behaviour they showed by doing that phone hacking scandal was deserved of the treatment they're getting now? And the second question is, where do you see the press going in the future because of these allegations when they want to say, get information?
Okay, two things.
Yeah.
So, in relation, it's very difficult for me to comment because there's ongoing trials. Do I think that the crimes they committed were on a parallel with rape, murder, armed robbery, burglary, threatening, menaces, mugging? No, I don't. I think that they were white-collar crime. I think people were injured. I think these people, their careers have been destroyed. I think they've been publicly humiliated. Will they do it again? No, they won't. Will the industry do it again? Only if they want to end up in the same sort of mess. So, in my opinion, the police activity has been politically driven and is disproportionate. So there's that. The second part of the question was how it's going to affect. Right. Now, and this actually worries me far more. I am heartbroken for what some of my colleagues, I know how bad what I went through was. It had tremendous personal costs, both on a practical and a personal level to me over the last 2 years. Tremendous personal cost. And I know I could tell you horror stories about what has happened to some of the individuals. There's been attempted suicides, there's been marriage breakups, there's alcoholism as a result of all this. Going back to, I think the big issue, of course, is this has been the excuse to bring in Leveson and an attempt to regulate, to bring in state regulation of the press. We've had 319 years of a free press. My big fear is that politicians who don't like newspapers and want to control them are trying to use this as a way to impose, to sneak in, if you like, state regulation. However tiny it can be, once it's in, it can be increased at a later point, and that is bad for us all. The other thing you've got to remember is that these allegations at most involve two national newspaper groups. There are 50,000 journalists in this country at the last. There was a census thing recently. 50,000 journalists. There are 22 Sun journalists have been arrested to do with paying backhanders in the main, alleged to have paid backhanders to public officials. There is a total of about 60 journalists been arrested out of between 50 and 60,000. Sadly, the ramifications for all of those journalists are going to be huge if the whole Leveson thing is allowed to continue. It has already had a significant impact on what media feels it is able to now investigate. I know a bunch of stories that the press are no longer or prepared to publish because they're scared of the opprobrium that will come out of from MPs. They don't know how the public are going to react, and so it's already had a significantly chilling effect. I know a horrendous political scandal that has not been published, and it's not been published because of the Leveson impact, if you like. So it's already had a tremendous effect on press freedom.
In broadcasting, Barbara, it hasn't really infected us in the same way, has it?
Well, we
Because you're
don't
already
do that.
regulated. Well,
That too.
are you regulated?
Yeah, by
are you?
Ofcom. Yeah, otherwise
Oh,
we
right.
couldn't
Yeah, yeah.
broadcast in the UK. Yeah, but I guess it goes back to that exclusives. We don't have that kind of inquisitive journalism, not in the same way. But I mean, I have to say, it was interesting. I'm sure everyone saw the Francois Hollande press interview where he spent an hour boring everyone with the minutiae of whatever. Sorry? It was a monologue, and then there was one question I think was prefaced by, "Thank you so much for letting us come here, Mr. President. We love being in the press pack." And I mean, that just makes you realize how aggressive but good the British press are, and it would be a shame. I mean, I'm not saying, mistakes are always made everywhere, but it would be a shame to see that curtailed.
Anybody else? Any more?
Much as I thought Hollande was boring, and much as I think he probably is a sleazebag, I'm not sure that's my interest. I'm not really interested in what he does on the back of a moped at whatever hour of the night. I am much more interested in the mess he's making of the French economy. But I wonder whether that's one of the ways in which Al Jazeera wins and loses, because although I think you're right, and I do watch Al Jazeera a lot, it has enormous cachet as a kind of hard news, very international, genuinely global channel. It doesn't have what the Daily Mail or the News of the World or even the BBC has, which is a kind of local connection. Who would Al Jazeera go after?
Well, the local connection is almost impossible. You're either an international channel or you're not. And I mean, I really noticed this as a presenter. When I was at BBC London, it was so easy because I knew that my audience, not only were they were even in London. And then at Sky, that even though they have some international viewers, you're talking to a UK audience. The strength and the negative side as well of being on an international channel is that you're kind of speaking to everyone and to no one, and that is just the nature, I think, of an international channel. And that's why you're seeing increasingly Al Jazeera launch specific channels. So we launched Al Jazeera America that went on air in August. There's an Al Jazeera Turk or Al Jazeera Balkans. There may be other sort of Al Jazeeras that are more localized. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I do think that there is an art to writing a story about something that is happening on the other side of the world that still has a human connection. So, right now we're on the verge of a genocide in CAR. There was a whole debate on Newsnight a few days ago about, does anyone care? Should we care? I think, apart from the fact that we should care because there's always repercussions, on a humane level, we kind of do because we all know what happened in Rwanda. So yeah, I mean, it's one of the difficulties, and we struggle with it every day. I remember, it's really funny, when Michael Jackson died. So obviously, Sky News, breaking news, they didn't speak about anything else. No one spoke of anything else. And we're being quite serious. And I'm just going, no, we shouldn't do it. Until I went on Twitter, and I follow quite a lot of people from the Middle East, and there was someone going, I remember listening to Beat It in Beirut when the bombs were falling down. Then I went to the editor and said, look, we really should do this story. So, there's not a formula that applies the whole time. You try to, do the serious stuff. We don't do frivolous things on purpose. But I think sometimes you think, well, actually, this has a global appeal. But it's hard.
You just defined freedom in a way. Freedom is and certainly press freedom, is the right for you to know about a land and decide you don't care. Freedom, or the lack of freedom, is you not knowing and therefore not being given the opportunity to care. That's the difference between the systems. You can decide it doesn't matter in full possession of the facts that François Mitterrand used state funds to have a mistress and a child by this mistress, and to house them in state-owned apartments and to give them a stipend so they could live off it. And he took them on holidays, etc., etc. Right? If you knew that, you could decide you didn't care. And that's the difference. Nobody in France, apart from the in crowd, if you like, of the media all knew. What they didn't do very arrogantly, they didn't tell you, the voter. Then you had the chance to decide whether you cared. If you don't know, you can't make that decision. That's what freedom's about.
Well, look, great point to end on freedom and the Great British Press. But we can carry on, of course, outside because there are some nibbles and some drinks. But for now, can I thank you both for taking the time to come all the way north and to sharing your insights, knowledge and experience with us. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.